Welcome, everybody. I'm not sure if you've been seeing Emory in the news recently, but would solicit your prayers for the entire campus community, for the students particularly who feel very passionately about their cause, and for those of us that are supporting them to make the space as peaceful and safe as possible for all involved. So please pray for us. Oh, you can't hear us. Let's see if we can get closer. Hello. Yes, I was asking for prayers for Emory and everything that's going on in our community right now. Yes, there's been multiple demonstrations, and the police were called on Thursday, and 2 of my students were arrested, quite violently. So we solicit your prayers. In the spirit of continuing with education and the role that I play in this community and others, I want to raise awareness for some other amazing women, not the least of which is Bridget of Kildare. All right, intensity of Radigan. That's where we were. What was so intense about Radigan?
She kind of talked up to men.
She did. She absolutely did. She she told her husband, King Clothar, who she was married to but never actually had relations with, that he could not come and visit her new community. And when some of Clothar's advisors suggested that he come and shut her down, his advisors lost their bowels in a curse, which was very, very exciting. Yes, I like those parts. Radigan was also terribly intense in everything she did. Everything she undertook was at level 100. So when she was caring for the poor, it wasn't that she was just caring for them. She sought out the lepers and she kissed the lepers' wounds and did not care that their scabby scabs were all over her. Delightful. She also endured a number of self-mortifications. She had chains that she put around her arms that she kept on until her flesh grew over the chains. She wore hair shirts, which are very, very spicy on the inside. And what I want us to remember about her, though, that, yes, sir?
She was the Paul groupie?
She never was the Paul groupie. That was the week before. No, but I think Radigan would also have been a groupie as well. Radigan was, in many ways, kind of this forefront of monastic education. Monastic leadership in the Merovingian Empire, and that's why her biographer calls her more monaca than monarcha. So that's a play on words in Latin, more nun than queen. She was also taken as an 11-year-old as a prisoner of war. So I would like to suggest that some of her self-mortification and the intensity with which she undertakes her faith may have something to do with that trauma response. And she also executes many, many, many of the activities that come to be very, very emblematic of female saints. Intercession for political prisoners, for slaves, charity for the poor, hospitality, relic acquisition. You'll remember that she received a piece of the true cross and the finger bone of Mamas, which indicated by the Saint Mamas himself that it wanted to be sent to her because when her emissary touched the finger bone, it just came off. My mother is horrified by this, that's okay. It's one of those things that relic acquisition, do we remember why relic acquisition was such a powerful move for women saints?
Is it like political?
Yes, it's a power play because people come to see the relics. So acquisition of the relic and the place where the relic lives is a way of getting people into your sphere of authority, both physically and economically. They come and visit, they spend money there, you become a place of world renown. And so it's not just getting the finger bone, although that's cool. It's about Radigan becoming a power player in the world of Christianity at this time. The fact that she's given a piece of the true cross is reminiscent of Constantine's mother Helena, who was the first female, not saint, but female Christian to receive a piece of the true cross. And this is sort of tying Radigan into that long generation of female Christians using proximity to relics and to the sacred as a part of asserting their authority in this world. So Radigan, extreme, very extreme, no doubt about it. However, these model female saint attributes, we saw also some of them in our previous saints, and we'll see them today with Bridget of Kildare. So these are the 4 really, if we count Perpetua and Felicitas, our first 2 saints that were murdered in the arena. Thecla, our Paul groupie, who was really, really obsessed with Paul, but who did not die in the arena. Does anyone remember what happened to her in the arena instead? Yes, ma'am.
Where was Radigan stationed?
Radigan was in modern-day France, and her in the Merovingian region of Francia. Thecla was in Asia Minor, Perpetua and Felicitas were in North Africa, and Bridget is in Ireland. Perpetua and Felicitas were, Thecla is actually our earliest. Perpetua and Felicitas was slightly later than that in the 3rd century. They were martyred. Thecla was not martyred. Instead, she miraculously survives several events in the arena, including a pool of rabid seals, which is awesome, within which she baptizes herself, right? Because Paul wouldn't baptize her. So we see sort of early testament to Christianity by Perpetua, who says to her father, her noble father, that she can't be anything other than what she is, which is a Christian. And there are repercussions for her family for her taking on that Christian faith. The same happens for Thecla, whose mom is really upset that she doesn't marry the person she's been picked out to marry, and instead goes and follows Paul around, getting into trouble in pretty much every city she enters because people want to marry her. And she refuses to get married because she's taken Paul's message of chastity to heart and refutes these marriage proposals and embarrasses the men, which causes her again to go into the arena. So Thecla, one of her arena experiences was with 2 lionesses that come and prevent the other animals in the arena from attacking her. And then we have Radigan, taken as a prisoner of war, does not take on any particular movements in the arena. And in fact, her biographer says explicitly she chooses the intensity of the way she practices her faith because martyrdom is no longer an option. So part of that intensity is trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian when Christianity is no longer persecuted, right? So by the 5th century, Christianity has spread all across Western Europe, North Africa, Asia Minor, and in fact, all the way to Ireland, which is where we will spend most of our time today. Are any of you of Irish heritage? The Irish feel very strongly and would like you to know that they were never conquered by the British. And by the British, they mean the Roman Empire. So Britannia is this red region here that was part of one of the Roman provinces. The last Roman garrisons left Britain, Roman Britain, in 410, at which point all of the tribes that we talked about last week that had been pushed forward into the west by the activity of the Huns in the east, some of those settled in Western Europe, like our Franks, right? The Franks, which is what Radigan is a part of. But the Frisians, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes made their way across the channel into what is now Great Britain. What's interesting about that is that the Frisians, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes are all pagan. So we have a clash of cultures somewhat in England, we'll call it England even though it wasn't in Britain at this time, between a new pagan set of tribes and the local tribes in this area, known as the Celts and the Scotti. Very unhelpfully, the Scotti are in modern-day Ireland, not Scotland. The Celts are in modern-day Scotland. It's very problematic for everything we know about all the things. But Christianity spreads all through these areas up into Ireland and the western portions of Britain, i.e. the portions of modern-day Britain that were not taken over by the Saxons and the Angles. So you see that yellow all on the western portion here, and what's interesting are these little squares with the little cross on the top. All of these are monastic communities. And what's important about the Christianity that develops in England and Ireland is that it is based not in an institutional or ecclesial episcopal structure that the church forms in pretty much of every other part of Western Europe. It's pushed forward by monastic identity. And when I say monastic, I mean monks and nuns. Does that make sense? Okay, so all of these little squares are new monastic communities, and you might wonder how Christianity actually made its way from Western Europe up into Ireland. There are a couple ways that this happened. Many of us know about Patrick. Patrick was not the first missionary to the Irish. Please hear me when I say that. Patrick was not the first missionary to the Irish. In fact, the first official mission to the Irish is in 431 by a guy named Palladius. And it's very unfortunate that his name sounds very similar to Patrick's, because they get a little bit conflated in the storytelling of this time period. So in 431, the Bishop of Rome sends Palladius up to Ireland to do some converting. And the Pope Celestine sends him up there because they need ecclesial leadership, and because most of what's happening in Britain right now is wishy-washy Christianity that falls a little bit into heresy. Pelagian heresy, among others. We won't go into the details of that because it's very theological, and I am not a theologian. But what I want you to see here is that monastic Christianity is what takes root rather than the missionaries or the bishops sent by the institution of the church in Rome. It's monastic, grassroots kind of Christianity that appears here, and that matches in many ways the small local nature of the political entities in Britain and Ireland at this time. So England, and Ireland's over here, we'll get to Ireland in a second. England is broken up into a number of smaller kingdoms. There is no King of England for quite some time, until we get to King Alfred, who's from Wessex. And the only reason he becomes king of all of England is because the Vikings wipe out everybody north of him, which is deeply convenient for Alfred. But that comes several centuries later. For now, when we're talking about the 5th and the 6th centuries, England and Ireland are a series of small, self-contained kingdoms, each of which has their own king, and each of which has their own cultural flavor, right? And so monasteries start to pop up on the eastern coast here. You may see some names you recognize. Whitby, Hilda of Whitby is a famous nun, which I wish we had time to talk about, but we don't. Lindisfarne, anyone seen the Lindisfarne Gospels? Some of our really famous manuscripts from this time period are from these monastic communities. And in Ireland, we similarly have a series of very small regional kingdoms. Every one of these squares is a monastic community. So when you think about the size of Ireland, the number of monastic communities here should jump out at you as a lot. That's a lot. Yes?
How many people were living in
That's a really great question. So each individual monastic community could have up to a couple hundred individuals. Smaller ones could have 50 or so, but most of them were quite large. And communities like Kildare, which is where Bridget is from, were double monasteries. They had a male community and a female community. And we'll hear how Bridget runs the female side and brings in Conleth, a local bishop, to run the male side. Okay? So what I want you to see here is a non-hierarchical approach to the organization of Christianity in Ireland. We know from what develops in Western Europe that we have a very hierarchical, we've got our pope, we've got our bishops, we got our presbyters, we got our deacons, we got our local priests, right? We like order, right? Presbyterians, you should be excited about the order. Well, the Irish were not about that. It was much more of a flattened engagement with the monastic communities in those regions, but you can see here too, what they start to create are coalitions of monasteries under the leadership of a single monastery. So the blue squares are monasteries that are attached to Patrick and his community at Armagh. So you'll notice lots and lots and lots and lots of blue squares. The red ones are monasteries associated with Iona. Many of you have heard of the Iona monastic community. And then the black ones are not aligned in any particular way. And Kildare is one of those. But we'll see part of the telling of Bridget's story is to collect some other monasteries to the Kildare cause. And we'll see Bridget roaming around Ireland doing a little bit of proselytizing on behalf of Kildare. So who is Bridget, right? Bridget may or may not have existed in reality. There is better evidence for the three women that we have talked about before now. We know for a fact that Perpetua and Felicitas, Thecla, and Radegund all existed. Bridget's a little bit more of a mythical figure, and part of that is because she gets conflated a little bit with Brigid, a local pagan goddess. And the stories about these two get merged together in a really interesting way. Syncretism. Does anyone know the word syncretism? It's a combining of elements of different religious practices into one sort of unified, culturally representative faith. So it's really interesting that Bridget gets combined with Brigid, our local Celtic goddess, and Bridget's, our saint, our Christian saints, her miracles are all what I would call earthy. They often involve butter, which is awesome. Love a saint of butter. They involve animals, they involve weather events, and they involve crops. So we start to see this melding of what you would expect of a local goddess, a goddess of fauna and flora, and a Christian saint. The way she does this is she does both of these activities, the intervening, the charity, the relic acquisition, and the protection of a fox, and a sunbeam that you can hang your cloak on. It's awesome. So, how do we know anything about Bridget? There are three vitae, and remember, vita is the Latin word for life. So there are three vitae of Bridget. The one that we're going to focus on today is written by a guy named Cogitosus. Fabulous name. Cogitosus in 650. And this was after, several years after when Bridget was supposed to have lived, which was somewhere in the 500s. But there are three versions of her life. And in Cogitosus's version, he assumes that Christianity is now everywhere in Ireland. That may not actually have been true at that time, but it gives us a sense of where he was involved. And I want to give you another quick look at this map to show you Armagh is up here in Northern Ireland. This is where St. Patrick of snake-defying fame is from. And you'll recall that Patrick was a slave in Ireland after he had been kidnapped. He's from an elite family in Roman Britain, gets kidnapped up there, very, very famous, comes back, does his snake banning thing or whatever. But Kildare, all the way down here in the south of Ireland, is where Bridget is from. And they both of these communities start to create spheres of influence that have slightly different flavors based on, in my opinion, gender, amongst other things. So we'll look at a series of these things. So here is a contemporary art mural in Dundalk depicting, which I thought it was just gorgeous image, the duality of the potential of the pagan Brigid and the Christian saint Bridget over here with her cross, very famous cross.
Is that cross made from corn?
It is made from wheat.
Wheat.
Yes. Yes. All right, so why did Cogitosus write this life? One of the things about hagiography, which is the writing about saints, is figuring out as much as you can the agenda of the person writing, right? So we read in Perpetua and Felicitas, this was letting local Christians know what had happened to one of their leaders. For Thecla, it was about creating a sphere of Christianity. We saw Thecla fighting against some of the Greco-Roman gods in Asia Minor. For Radegund, it was about propping up the identity of her monastic house in Poitiers. For Cogitosus and the life of Bridget, it's similar to Radegund. So this is what he says about why he's writing. He says, "It is to be hoped that these virtues will bring to the public eye the greatness and the worth of the Virgin radiant with good virtues. Not that my memory and mediocrity or the rustic speech of my limited talent could adequately accomplish so great a task, but your blessed faith and your daily prayers deserve a reward which is beyond the capacity of a narrator." The humility tropes of medieval and early Roman authors just crack me up every time. So, she, Bridget, continued to grow in outstanding virtue, and as countless people of both sexes, drawn by the fame of her good deeds, flocked to her from every province throughout the whole of Ireland and pledged their vows to her. She built a monastery on the plains of Maglith on the firm foundation of faith. It is the head of almost all the Irish churches, with supremacy over all the monasteries of the Irish. Patrick. And its parochia, so that's another word for parish, right? The region or which it claims authority over, extends over the whole land of Ireland, reaching from sea to sea. And as by her wise administration she made provision in every detail for the souls of her people according to the rule, as she vigilantly watched over the churches attached to her in many provinces and conferred ecclesiastical orders in them, she sent for Conleth, a famous man and a hermit endowed with every good disposition, through whom God wrought many miracles, and calling him from the wilderness and his life of solitude, she set out to meet him in order that he might govern the church with her in the office of bishop, and that her churches might lack nothing as regards priestly orders. So why is Cogitosis writing this life? Yes, to let people know what? Yes, let people know about Bridget. To let people know about Bridget, to let people know about Kildare and the authority that he believes Kildare should have amongst the churches in Ireland. So it's about Bridget, but it's also about the legacy that Bridget left at Kildare and propping up that legacy and continuing it on by sharing a set of really awesome stories, right? That's what's so great about Saints' lives. They draw you in, right? They're participatory. They're engaging. And nothing will prop up the fame and authority and legitimacy of your community like having a miraculous founder, right? That's why we tell George Washington and the cherry tree stories, right?
Sarah, was the fact that Kildare was a little bit more central
Yeah.
in Ireland, so it was able to grab up?
Absolutely. Yep.
Land.
Yep. Absolutely. And we'll see too, Bridget is constantly moving around, being visible and doing miraculous things. So there's a sort of increasing concentric circles of authority that she, or Cogitosis, is trying to develop for Kildare. So what was her childhood like? Remember what Radigan's childhood was like? After she was taken as a prisoner of war, she basically ran around having little ceremonies with the children in her house, carrying a cross, serving Eucharist. It's a common trope in hagiography that the childhoods of saints prefigure the glorious virtues that they will have when they are adults. And they do not in any way, shape, or form make real sense for children that I have met. But here we go. When she was old enough, she was sent by her mother, Bridget was sent by her mother to do the work of churning. So that, I told you there was going to be a lot of butter today. To make up the butter from the cow's milk, which had been dashed. She was meant to carry out this work in the same way as other women, and to deliver it, once it was completed, in the customary weight and measure at the appointed time with the others. So she's going out with the women to churn the butter. However, Bridget, with the most beautiful and generous disposition, prefers to obey God rather than men, and distributes the milk and butter liberally to the poor and guests. So, when the appointed time comes for all to hand in what the cows had yielded, her turn came, and when her workmates presented the finished result of their work, the aforementioned Blessed Maiden was also requested to hand in her work in like manner. In dread of her mother, since she had nothing to show, because she had given the lot away to the poor without a thought for the morrow, strengthened and inflamed with an ardor of faith so intense and unquenchable, she turned to the Lord and prayed. Without delay, the Lord heard the maiden's voice and prayers, and being a helper in the hour of need, he came to her assistance with the generous bestowal of a divine gift, and lavishly restored the butter for the maiden who had confidence in him. Astonishingly, the very moment after her prayer, the most holy maiden proved that she had fulfilled her task by showing that nothing was missing from the fruit of her work, but in fact, it was even more abundant than her workmates. And when the miracle of this great gift was fully discovered and came to the public notice, everyone praised God who had wrought it, and they marveled that there was such power of faith in a maiden's heart. So what do we make of the miraculous butter story? This is the first of 4 butter miracles. What do you make of this?
It's like the fish story.
Absolutely. There's so many biblical resonances here, right? When you are without, for whatever reason, in this case because you've already provided to the poor, God provides for you. And it's the origin story almost of Bridget. This story goes around. She's the miraculous maiden with faith in her heart who has overflowing butter. Would that was only our story ourselves. So, as I was talking about, part of Cogitosis's vision for this story is that it demonstrates Kildare's authority in Ireland vis-a-vis other monastic communities. To show this, Bridget is constantly racing around Ireland in her 2-wheeled chariot with 2 horses. And I'm going to show you some ways that she does this. So one day, when our most saintly Bridget, in response to some urgent practical need, and I have no idea what that was, but I really hope it was butter related, was going to hold a meeting of the people, she rode along, seated in the 2-horse chariot. While in her chariot, she was praying to her master in contemplative meditation, as was her practice, living a heavenly life on earth. When the 2nd horse reared restively under the chariot on the way down from a height, and unchecked by reins, forcibly wrenched himself free. Having worked himself free of the yoke on his own accord, he ran terrified across the plains, while the other horse remained alone in his yoke. It's a 2-horse chariot. You can't run it with one, but you can. Thereupon the hand of God kept the yoke suspended without letting it fall, and while the crowd watched this public testimony of divine power, she went on praying unperturbed in her vehicle with 1 horse in its place under the chariot, and reached the assembly of people unharmed after a pleasant ride. And so, confirming her teaching by signs and miracles, she addressed the people with salutary words seasoned with divine salt. So there's a lot going on here, right? On the one hand, it's a story of a miracle. A 2-horse chariot should not run with 1 horse. But she's able to continue praying without ceasing. She had a lovely ride. But do you notice what she does when she gets there? She's confirming her teaching by signs and miracles. So what's interesting about the Vita by Cogitosis is he never tells us the content of most of these speeches. We'll see on the next slide there is one speech we hear, but he gives the impression of an itinerant preacher. She's going around from place to place in her chariot, spreading the good word, and by virtue of miracles happening along the way, demonstrating her sanctity while she's teaching. So in many ways, this felt Thecla-esque to me. Thecla does a lot of moving from city to city, teaching and preaching without the authorization of Paul because he's a jerk. Bridget doesn't need anybody's authorization. She is the authorization in Kildare. She's the one that brought Conleth to Kildare. She's the one that's producing all the miracles. And so the movement that we see is a spreading of the glory of God via the glory of Bridget. And like we saw with Radegund, we also see Bridget clashing with local political elites. It's not just other monastic houses that she's in some competition with, it's also with the local king. So it's a complicated story. The king had a favorite fox, as Irish kings do. And the fox runs away, and a local peasant, not knowing that this was the king's fox, because how would he know that? It just looks like a fox, kills this fox. And the king then has this peasant brought up on murder charges because of the death of the fox. Okay? So when Bridget hears about this, when the holy and venerable Bridget learned what had taken place, grieving in her inmost heart and pouring forth prayers to the Lord for this unfortunate who had been unjustly sentenced, she was moved with deep feelings of compassion and pity and ordered her chariot to be yoked for her, and she drove across the plain and produced miraculously from the woods an identical fox, which she gives to the king, who then pardons the peasant. Feels a little bit like Robin Hood, which, again, I love. But again, the point here is not the fox, although the fox is the fantastic part. Thank you. All right, you got my pun. We're all alive and awake today. Excellent. So it's not just that she has, again, miraculous authority over animals. That's absolutely a signature of Bridget's saintly activity. It's also that she's interceding on behalf of a prisoner, which we saw with Radagant. The butter miracle at the very beginning wasn't just about the miraculous provision of butter. It was about charity for the poor and those in need. These are all tropes of the virtues of female saints, but they're deeply powerful, even though they're sort of, they feel in some ways domestic, and sort of, oh, you're in the house, we're dealing with the butter, right there. It's not about that. It's about the way charity is employed in really, really interesting ways. And in this case, the intervention on behalf of this particular prisoner demonstrates her authority amongst the political regions of Ireland, not just the monastic ones. And contemporary scholar Andrew McCone says that Bridget's movements might very well serve as the golden opportunity for Kildare to claim nearby monastic and ecclesial communities as part of its paruchia. Again, that parish, the region in which Kildare is sort of the central monastic house. Precisely because the relationship between Kildare and Armagh, between a female saint and traditional male saint, was a contested one, both the Vita Cogitosus and the Vita Prima Brigida, that's the other version of her life, made an emphatic statement of Bridget's pan-Irish provenance and power. Okay? Fascinating. We haven't talked much about it yet, but gender, of course, plays a pretty significant role in her life. We see at the very beginning of the narrative, like every single one of the women we've talked about before, except for Perpetua and Felicitas, who are already married, someone wants to marry Bridget. But her reluctance to do so is again emblematic of her faith. When her parents wanted to betroth her to a man according to the custom of the world, differentiating the Christian faith from the customs of the secular world, Bridget, inspired from above and wanting to devote herself as a chaste virgin to God, went to the most holy Bishop Michael of blessed memory. Seeing her heavenly desire and modesty, and seeing so great a love of chastity in this remarkable maiden, he placed the white veil and white garment over her venerable head. And kneeling humbly before God and the bishop as well as before the altar, and offering her virginal crown to the Almighty God, she touched with her hand the wooden base on which the altar rested. And commensurate to her unsullied virtue, this wood flourished fresh and green to the present day, as if it had not been cut down and stripped of its bark, but was still attached to its roots. And to this day, it rids all the faithful of affliction and diseases. A lot of layers there, too. What's going on? Yes, right? We have a contact relic, right? Relics are not just the bones and hairs and blood of the saints. It can also be things that saints touched. And this saint touched the altar on which she was consecrated as a nun, and it's blooming. It's like if obviously I am not a saint because nothing is happening here, but it bloomed, right? And it's also a site of healing miracles. So again, we see all of these layers coming together, all underneath this first emphatic testament to her virginity, to her chastity, right? To her very forcible denial of a marriage proposal, right? And this next one is going to be controversial, but I wanted to show it to you. One of her other miracles was performing an abortion. With the strength of faith and most powerful and ineffable, she blessed a woman who, after a vow of virginity, had lapsed through weakness into youthful concupiscence, as the result of which her womb had begun to swell with pregnancy. In consequence, what had been conceived in the womb disappeared, and she restored her to health and to penitence without childbirth or pain. And in accordance with the saying, all things are possible to those who believe, she went on working countless miracles every day without anything ever proving impossible. Yep. So again, this very strong connection to the women in her communities, a focus on chastity as still the highest ideal that a woman can achieve. And again, this is part of holding these things in tension that we maybe are not so, it's not our feminist agenda that I really want to see, but we want to hold these things in tension. We also, as I've said, see nature showing up all over the place, right? From the very beginning with the miraculous restoration of the dead wood in the altar and the miraculous immersion of butter, we also see a series of nature prayers. We see a dry harvest on a rainy day, a miraculous protection of the dry harvest on a rainy day. Cooked bacon that has been stolen by a dog is later recovered perfectly clean. Told you these were earthy. There's a garment that she has that is thrown over a sunbeam, and it just sits there on the sunbeam. I'm not sure exactly what that miracle is supposed to convey, but it's very cool. We also see water blessed and turned into ale. Does this remind anyone of water and wine? Okay. We see stone changed into salt. The miraculous recovery of lost livestock, which include a cow, pigs, horse, and a boar. And perhaps most emphatically, we also see the diversion of a river that has been flooded and threatens local crops. So again, what we're seeing here is a deep connection both to the place, to the land, and to the people's livelihood. All of these, except for the sunbeam, I'm not sure what's going on with the sunbeam, all of these are connected to protecting people in the parochia of Kildare from natural disasters, which says a lot about her and her connection again to that local goddess. This is an image of Kildare as it might have been. And one of the things that I think is particularly important about Kildare and Bridget is that Bridget is interred at Kildare, and there's a miracle that happens associated with her tomb. Conleth, who outlives her, he passes the night praying by the glorious tomb of Bridget, and getting up in the morning after that night, having completed his prayer with faith, he had the old door pushed in and placed on its hinges, and it filled the whole door. Neither did it lack anything in fullness, nor was it in any respect excessive in size. And so this is an old door being put in a new door location. And so Bridget extends the door, which is too small for the space in which it's been placed in the new monastery. And Bridget extends the door in height so that the whole doorway is filled by it, and no gap appeared in it, except when the door was pushed back for people to go into church. And this miracle of God's power was revealed clearly to the eyes of all who saw the door and the doorway. And who can express in words the exceeding beauty of this church and the countless wonders of that monastic city we are speaking of, if one may call it a city, since it is not encircled by any surrounding wall? And yet, since numberless people assemble within it, and since a city gets its name from the fact that many people congregate there, it is a vast and metropolitan city. In its suburbs, which St. Bridget had marked out by a definite boundary, no human foe or enemy attack is feared. On the contrary, together with all its outlying suburbs, it is the safest city of refuge in the entire land of the Irish for all fugitives. And the treasure of kings are kept there. Moreover, it is looked upon as the most outstanding on account of its illustrious supremacy. So this is the way the Vita Cogitosus ends, with a Bridget's grave overseeing the miraculous restoration of the door of the church itself. And they call this church a city, the safest city for fugitives and believers in all of Ireland. And it marks out the region that Bridget herself had defined with her two-wheeled chariot running around the Irish land That's the region over which Cogitosus and Kildare believe that they have. So what do you make of this monastic traveling nun/goddess? Pretty cool. Lots of butter. Lots of butter. That's what you're going to remember next week is the miracle of the butter. What do you make of her in comparison to some of the other women that we've studied?
I think she's a little harder to believe.
Aha, yes, so she's,
At least for me.
yes, so we've moved from the hagiographic maybe into the mythical. Yep, and for a founding saint, that makes sense. You've got to make it pretty dramatic in order for the story to do the inviting of people to your place, right? That's the point. It's a little bit more miraculous, or fantastical, maybe even we've moved past miraculous. What else? Yeah, Leslie.
Well, it seems interesting to me that there's Patrick,
Yes.
and then he determines that even if it's mythical, that's even more interesting.
Yep.
That he chose a female figure, and then there is all the domestication.
Absolutely, yep.
But that's really interesting.
And that Kildare is as much a part of Irish Christianity and monastic identity as Armagh is, but none of you have heard of Bridget.
No,
You had heard of Bridget. Now you have all heard of Bridget, but everybody has heard of Patrick, right? He wasn't even that good of a writer. Terrible Latin, I tell you what.
I think they used to mold butter in the shape of Bridget.
I think they should. I think they should. We should get on that. Yeah. But it's a fantastical, exciting story. It's less alarming than a Radegund or a Thecla or a Perpetua, right? It's say it again?
Less violent.
Less violent, absolutely. It's earthy, right? We're dealing with bacon and butter and foxes, not chains with flesh growing over them or lions attacking us in the arena, right? But it's also deeply monastic in the same way that Radegund's story was monastic. And it's deeply geographic in the way Thecla's story was about establishing the identity of Thecla in Asia Minor and Seleucia, the place where her death ultimately happens. So these hagiographies, these writings about saints, have a variety of different purposes. One of them is absolutely propaganda for a particular location. They want you to come to Kildare. It's the best place to come, especially if you're a fugitive or you want to see some cool stuff. Maybe get healed of something, right? But it's also about establishing a female-founded monastic community as central to Irish Christian identity and central to the way monasticism develops in Ireland. And for that, I think we ought to thank Bridget. Awesome. Well, thank y'all so much. I'll stick around. You have to go to church. But next week, we'll be doing my favorite, Hrotsvit of Gandasheim, which I guarantee no one but my mother has heard before. She writes a series of saints' lives and plays, and we might even pass out a play to read out together. Oh, yes. It's going to be awesome, so get prepared. Yeah. Awesome. Thank y'all so much.